What could possibly take down Rolex? Back in the 1970s, this luxury giant was fighting for survival, and the thing that nearly destroyed them, you'd never guess it. So stick around because his comeback story is pretty wild. In 1969, a seismic tech revolution struck the watch world. On Christmas Day, Seiko unveiled the Quartz Astron. This was the world's first quartz wristwatch, and it was like dropping a tech grenade into the Swiss watchmaking party. Unlike traditional mechanical watches, this little battery-powered marvel used an electronic quartz movement that vibrated at thousands of times per second. By the late 1970s, quartz watches were more precise than mechanical Rolexes, and also cheaper. It was so surprising that a watch powered by a tiny crystal could keep time better than a finely tuned Rolex chronometer at a fraction of the price. For consumers, it was a no-brainer. I mean, why pay champagne prices for a Swiss mechanical when a quartz could do the job for the price of soda? Suddenly, the very selling point of Rolex was undercut, and they were caught off guard. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning of the chaos. The real quake was coming next. By the early 1970s, Switzerland's watchmakers, especially Rolex, realized they were facing a full-blown quartz crisis. The Swiss had long dominated the global watch market, enjoying 50% share of world sales. They weren't blind to quartz technology. In fact, a community of Swiss brands, including Rolex, Omega and Patek Philippe, had jointly developed a quartz movement called Beta 21 in 1970. Rolex even used the Beta 21 in its limited edition quartz date 5100 model. However, the Swiss were engineers of micromechanics, not electronics. More reason, the early Swiss quartz watches were big and extremely expensive. Interestingly, Seiko quickly improved the tech and slashed prices, while the Swiss lagged behind. That's why by 1975, Seiko had shipped 1.7 million quartz watches and up to 25 million by 1980. These guys literally flooded the world with cheap timepieces. On the other hand, Swiss stores were stuck with expensive quartz models that no one wanted. It was like the old masters of time were losing the race against time itself. Let's just say it was only a matter of time before the bloodbath that nearly wiped out Rolex happened. The late 70s brought a doomsday scenario for Swiss watches. As quartz watches went mainstream globally, Swiss mechanical watch sales collapsed. The statistics of buyers dropped from roughly 1,600 in 1970 to only 600 by 1983. Even the industry employment fell from 90,000 workers in 1970 to just 28,000 by the late 1980s. Imagine 2/3 of an entire industry vanishing in just over a decade. Lots of famous brands went bankrupt or disappeared, and those that survived were on life support. This period saw venerable names like Omega, Breitling, and others needing rescue or forced into mergers. The Swiss franc's soaring value and a global recession didn't help either, as exports got more expensive. It felt like the Swiss watchmaking tradition was breathing its last. Even Rolex, the crown of Swiss watches, was not left out. So, how did Rolex avoid tumbling into the abyss that swallowed so many competitors? Desperate times call for daring measures, and Rolex was about to pull a rabbit out of the hat. When your signature product becomes obsolete, you either evolve or die. Actually, Rolex did the unthinkable in the 1970s. It embraced the very technology threatening its existence and started making quartz watches. How did that happen? First off, Rolex joined the Beta 21 project and released the limited edition Rolex Quartz date, reference 5100, with a Beta 21 movement. Only about 1,000 were made. Initially, this was a test to see if Rolex could run on a battery and still be a Rolex. Then in 1977, Rolex took an even bolder step and introduced the Oyster Quartz line with its in-house quartz movement. These watches looked unlike any Rolex before. They had a sharp angular case with an integrated bracelet. In fact, the Oyster Quartz Day Date and Date Just models were the first Rolexes to use sapphire crystal glass. And in true Rolex fashion, they over-engineered their quartz movement with 11 jewels and COSC chronometer certification. This move is similar to when Ferrari quietly started rolling out an electric car during a fuel crisis. It was a risky bet. Purists were shocked, but it showed that Rolex wasn't going down without a fight. Interestingly, that wasn't the only trick up Rolex's sleeve. To truly escape bankruptcy, the crown needed more than new tech. To survive the quartz crisis, Rolex had to redefine the brand story. The CEO of Rolex, André Eniger, famously declared that Rolex was not in the watch business but in the luxury business. If Quartz made accurate timekeeping cheap, Rolex would convince people that owning one was about prestige, heritage and exclusivity. These were qualities that a $50 Casio would never give you. In reality, it meant doubling down on quality and luxury. So Rolex made watches with more gold, two-tone models and gem-set dials. This led to the timeless design of icons like the Submariner and Datejust. Also, Rolex marketing shifted into high gear. Add lines like "When a man has the world in his hands, you expect to find a Rolex on his wrist." Positioned the watch as the mark of achievers and aspirational elites. Even though Quartz rivals were mass-produced in the millions, a Rolex remained something you earned or received to mark a lifetime milestone. This strategy paid off massively in the long run. By convincing the world that a mechanical Rolex was a work of art and tradition, Rolex insulated itself from the tech arms race. Why worry about Quartz if your customers are buying a Rolex to feel like James Bond or a CEO? But could Rolex hold out long enough for it to work? With so many brands gone, Rolex had to survive the worst before the turnaround came. Meanwhile, if you love this horological roller coaster, smash that like button and subscribe for more. Now, through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Rolex stood strong as an independent brand. Omega, Breitling and others ended up merging or being bought out to stay alive, but Rolex never changed hands or sought a bailout. One advantage was Rolex's unique ownership. The company is 100% owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a charitable trust set up by its founder. That structure meant Rolex wasn't placed at the mercy of shareholders who were panicking. Nevertheless, they still felt the pain of the losses. In fact, some reports suggest that Rolex had to cut back production and lay low on innovation for a few years. Regardless, they didn't compromise on their core values. Quality over quantity remained the mantra. In a way, Rolex's conservative approach helped here. They never flooded the market with products, so they didn't have massive oversupply when demand dropped. Also, their strong brand loyalty meant there was always a baseline of customers who had to wear a Rolex, and Quartz be damned. It also helped that Rolex did innovate in subtle ways. First off, they improved mechanical movements and bracelets during the 80s. By the time the dust settled, Rolex emerged unbroken compared to most. Like a heavyweight champion that took some hits but refused to go down, the crown was bruised but still standing. This set the stage for a dramatic comeback. And speaking of comeback, guess what happens when the world starts loving mechanical watches again? Surprisingly, the mechanical watches that Quartz nearly killed began a resurgence in the 1980s and 90s. The low point of the crisis saw a saviour in the form of Nicholas G. Hayek. He led a merger of Swiss brands to create the Swatch Group and released the Swatch watch in 1983. This was a cheap quartz watch that kept Swiss factories busy. Swatch mopped up the low end, but it also did something important. It bought time for Swiss makers to refocus on the high end. By the late 80s, consumers had developed a newfound appreciation for how mechanical watches were made. The idea of a watch as art and investment took hold. Luxury brands like Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and of course Rolex rode this wave by pushing their heritage and exclusivity. As one account noted, mechanical watches went on to become a better business than ever. Then, Rolex found itself perfectly positioned, since it had never stopped making mechanical icons like the Submariner, Daytona, and Datejust. Now, those models became hotter than ever, precisely because they weren't modern or electronic. Even collectors in the 1990s started chasing vintage Rolexes. On the other hand, Rolex leaned into celebrating anniversaries with special editions and keeping production numbers relatively low. By the 2000s, Rolex was already thriving. The quartz crisis had forced Rolex to become more luxurious and desirable than it had ever been. Now that the crisis is over, how far has Rolex risen since those dark days? The idea of Rolex going bankrupt is laughable because these guys are on top of their game. Remember how we said Rolex embraced luxury and scarcity? Well, they're now in their hype era. The brand today could sell every watch it makes 5 times over. They produce over 1 million watches per year, and yet there are wait lists years long for many models. For instance, a stainless steel Rolex Daytona that's retailing at $15,100 has an estimated 5-year waiting list. That's if you try to buy through an authorized dealer. Even a Submariner or a GMT Master 2 often requires knowing a guy who knows a guy just to get the chance to buy at retail. This insane demand means popular Rolex models often resell for 50 to 100% above retail in the secondary market. Basically, a Rolex can be harder to score than Taylor Swift concert tickets. The company that once struggled to sell any watches in the 1970s now has too many people begging to give them money. Rolex has even had to adapt to this modern craze. In late 2022, they launched a certified pre-owned Rolex program to legitimize second-hand sales. And in 2023, Rolex made headlines by buying the famed watch retailer Bucherer. Not just that, let's talk about auctions. In 2017, Paul Newman's personal Rolex Daytona sold for $17.8 million. This was the most expensive wristwatch ever sold at the time. So how about we share the lessons from this wild ride? Rolex did dabble in quartz to survive, but it never lost sight of its core identity. In an age when gadgets come and go, Rolex doubled down on being the opposite of disposable tech. Ironically, that's exactly what saved it. Today, we're in another technological whirlwind with smartwatches on our wrists that can do everything from tracking sleep to streaming music. Yet Rolex watches remain in a league of their own. The same scenario as the quartz crisis is playing out in a sense. Now, cheap and hyper-functional smartwatches by Apple and others have saturated the market. But rather than spell doom for Rolex, it only made the distinction clearer, and that all traces back to the decisions Rolex made in the 1970s. By surviving that trial by fire, Rolex ensured that it would never just be a timekeeper but a symbol. The company is now so secure that it's run by a non-profit foundation, funneling its profits into charity and long-term stability. So here we are, full circle with technological revolutions keep happening. However, Rolex stands tall as a luxury titan forged in the fire of the quartz crisis. And speaking of luxury and comebacks, you won't want to miss our next video on Lionel Messi's watch collection. Go check it out now and thank me later. Until next time, keep living in luxury and on your own time.